Welcome back to our next video on the atonement, on what really happened at the cross. If you're watching these with me as I post them, you might say, man, it's been a while since he posted anything, and that's because I've been so busy. I just haven't been able to take some time to make these videos. But I just wanted to put this one out there today because the next theory of the atonement that we're going to talk about is called the moral influence theory of the atonement. And this one, I think, has become very popular in today's world, in our society today. And I think one of the problems with it, of course, we're going to evaluate it a little bit at the end. One of the problems with it is it doesn't really talk about anything that actually happened at the cross. It's called moral influence theory simply because what Jesus did on the cross was not take our place for our sin or do anything necessarily to bring us to God, but merely to set an example where we would look at what Jesus did on the cross, and not just on the cross, but his whole life, where we look at him and say, wow, that is what an example that we should try to live up to. And then we'd be like him. And over time, that's what would bring us to God. So it's really kind of a work-based thing. So that's the moral example theory or moral influence theory. But I want to show you this here first. We'll look at this again in the end, but these are different theories of the atonement as we've been talking about. Moral influence, I think there are some good parts of the moral influence theory. The idea that, yes, the death of Jesus and the whole life of Jesus was an example to us, but it is not the heart of the atonement. And so we're going to look at this one a little bit today. First of all, I'm going to show you this guy here, a picture of this guy, okay? Peter Abelard. Many people will point back to Peter Abelard as being sort of the one who came up with this idea, who began to propagate it a little bit. He's kind of known for this theory. I'm going to read this quote from William Lane Craig as he is quoting Abelard. So this is William Lane Craig quoting Abelard here. And he says this, nevertheless, it seems to us that in this we are justified in the blood of Christ and reconciled to God. So how are we justified by God? This way, that it was through this matchless grace shown to us that his Son received our nature, and in that nature, teaching us both by word and by example, persevered to the death and bound us to himself even more through love, so that when we have been kindled by so great a benefit of divine grace, true charity might fear to endure nothing for his sake. So basically the idea is, what did Jesus do at the cross? How, what effect did that have? And basically this, that as he went to the cross, as he became a man, and as he went to the cross, he showed us by not just his word, but also his example, how we're supposed to live. He persevered all the way to the end, and he gave us this great love. And that is what we're supposed to be looking. And then as we copy that, that is what brings us to God. So really the cross is not a substitution. The cross is not a payment. The cross is really nothing more than just an illustration of God's divine grace, where God would show us his grace, and we were to look at that and we would say, wow, that's how we should live. So now this is a quote from William Lane Craig. I believe I got this from his book called The Atonement. Good book to read if you haven't read it already. Not really a long book. But he says this, so Abelard sees atonement as achieved. Let me try that again. So Abelard sees atonement achieved as Christ's passion enkindles in our hearts a love for God within us. We are liberated then from sin as we come to love God more and more, and so become more and more righteous. Do you see that? He's saying we get to God more as we understand better what God did, and that as we then copy him, we become more and more righteous. Man, that sounds to me like a work salvation. I continue to quote William Lane Craig. The atonement, as he's talking about Abelard's theory of the atonement, okay? These are not William Lane Craig's thoughts. The atonement works by means of Christ's exemplary death on the cross, which then produces in us this effect of loving God more and more, so that we become progressively freed from sin. So as we look at what Jesus did on the cross, we begin to copy him more and more. As we begin to copy Jesus more and more in what he did on the cross, that allows us to become then set free from sin more and more. So what we have is a work salvation over time. And that seemed to be a lot of the idea of what Peter Abelard believed. Now, William Lane Craig does go on to point out that this doesn't seem to be the only aspect of the atonement that Abelard believed, just like many of these other early church fathers we can pull one statement out. We can say, well, this is exactly what they believed about the atonement. But then we can find other statements that they have, and maybe they had different views. So Abelard does seem to say some things that point to penal substitution, at least that he had a multifaceted view of the atonement, which was correct. But he did seem to focus in on this one a little more. Now, an interesting point here about Peter Abelard. Peter Abelard was hired at Notre Dame in Paris. And while he was there, he became a private tutor for a girl named Heloise. And this young girl, he began to groom her sexually, and eventually she fell in love with him, and they had a secret child. Well, when her uncle, Fulbert, found out about this, he was one of the clergy associated with Notre Dame. When he found out about this, he was angry and had Abelard castrated. And then Heloise went on to live in a nunnery, and he went on to become a prominent theologian known for the moral example theory. So take it for what it's worth. That's kind of a little bit of history right there. But really the bigger name that we think of when we think of this is this guy right here, Friedrich Schleiermacher. Friedrich Schleiermacher. He wrote a book called The Christian Faith. All right, you can even you can get this book or maybe download it somewhere. In his book, he talks about how the death of Jesus and the life of Jesus was about showing his example to us. Here's a quote from Schleiermacher. For in his suffering unto death, occasioned by his steadfastness, there is manifested to us an absolutely self-denying love. So what happened when Jesus went to the cross? He was showing us a self-denying love. Now, was he? Yes, he was. But Schleiermacher goes on then to combat what we, if you think like I do, what we would think of as the correct view of the atonement, which is substitutionary atonement, where he took our place for us, and that it was penal substitutionary, where there's a penalty that he paid in our place. So let me read this quote from Schleiermacher too. He's going to talk about wounds theology. Wounds theology, in his view, is the idea that we focus on the actual wounds of Jesus. He didn't care so much about the wounds of Jesus, other than the general idea that Jesus did this great thing for us and we should copy him. And so he says this. The first is that although it is in a specially impressive way from his suffering that we gain a true understanding of Christ, yet this is no justification for the triviality of the so-called wounds theology, once very widespread but now almost obsolete, which thought to find deep import of the suffering of Christ in its sensuous details, and hence, for the sake of allegorical trivialities, broke up into details the totality of Christ's suffering. So what he's saying is here is you guys who are so focused on, the looking at the wounds of Jesus and how the Bible talks about my beard being ripped from me and the crown of thorns and the whipped and all this penalty that he took for us. He's saying you don't get so bogged down in those details. That's not a big deal. What's the big deal is that he did something for love for you. It's not so much that you had a penalty and he paid it, but no, he loved you and you need to copy his love. Boy, does that sound like today's so-called Christianity or not. So his idea is that love or that Jesus' death was really just an example for us, just like Jesus would come and become a man and he would die for you. Don't worry about the wounds. Don't worry about the penalty. Don't worry about all that. Just look at this overall general example that Jesus did. And you should go out and live like that too. And as you do that, you're going to be moving further away from your sin and you're going to attain salvation in that way. So, he goes on to argue, Schleiermacher goes on here to argue, obviously more about, you need to pay attention to the wounds of Jesus or anything like that. And he also goes on to argue about how the sacrifice of Jesus didn't necessarily have to equal the sum of all mankind's sin. As part of penal substitution, we understand that, you take every man who's ever sinned, and the singular death of Jesus is enough to cover for all that. Well, Schleiermacher didn't believe that. First of all, he didn't need any kind of penalty substitution in his view, but he rejected the idea that Jesus suffered enough to cover for everybody else. He says this: the second misunderstanding is to take the formula that through the suffering of Christ, the punishment of sin is taken away. A formula perfectly correct when interpreted as explained above to mean that he bore the punishment. That is, that his suffering was equal to the sum of evils constituting the amount of the punishment for the sins of the human race, since otherwise the divine righteousness will not have been satisfied. He's just taking that whole thing. Think about Jesus being equal to all of humanity. Just forget that. That's not a big deal. You don't need to worry about that. Another thing that he discussed was the term vicarious. Now, when we use the term vicarious, we think of almost like you can do vicarious voting. I can't be there, so somebody else is going to vote in my place and as my substitute. Well, Schleiermacher he said, yeah, it's okay. You can use the term vicarious as far as Christ's suffering, but it wasn't so much that he was your substitution, but that he experienced it for you. Jesus came, he wasn't a man, so he shouldn't have ever experienced this pain and suffering or anything, but he did it. It's like he allowed himself to be like you in a certain way. And that's what he means by vicarious. So many times when we study theology, we see that we're using the same words, but we have a different dictionary. And this is one of those cases. So to me, vicarious in the sense of the atonement is that he did it instead of me. I should have been there and he did it for me. Schleiermacher says, yeah, you can use that term, but that's not what it means. What it means is that he didn't have to become a man, but he did. And he identified with you as a man, and he did all these great things, and now you should copy him. So that is basically the moral influence theory. It's actually very simple to understand. It's just not biblical as far as the main facet of the atonement. So let's evaluate it here quickly, and I think I've already kind of evaluated it as we're going along. It's really kind of obvious. But first of all, a couple of statements. First of all, a true claim that is made in moral example theory or moral influence theory. First true claim is the death of Jesus does serve as an example. I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? Let me read this to you. It might be familiar. Philippians chapter 2, verse 5 to 8. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of man. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. So even Paul there in Philippians is saying, look, you should be like Jesus. He who did not consider it robbery to be equal with God. To me, if I say I'm like God, that's robbery. That's taking something from God. Jesus could say that, and it was true, so it wasn't a problem. But he, even as God, he even came down to be like man, and you should follow his example. That's what Paul says, but he doesn't say that's the main thing that Jesus did. He's just saying, yes, Jesus did that, so you should copy him. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. For to this you were called. What were you called to? This. Because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps. So yeah, he left us example, no question. That's a good part of the moral influence theory, is that yes, everything Jesus did, it does provide us an example. Wow, Jesus would go to the cross for me. Maybe I should be willing to give up things for him and for other people. He even uses this as an example for marriage. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, right? So yes, you're supposed to copy him. You're supposed to be like that. That's a true claim. However, looking at moral influence as the primary aspect of the atonement falls way short. And for this reason right here, here's a false claim that is made by the moral influence theory, is that the only effect of the death of Jesus is his example. No, it is a result. We look at it and we say, wow, we should be like that. But that is not the main thing that happened there at the cross. That wasn't the purpose. The purpose was not to set an example. The purpose was to take our punishment for us, and in so doing, he did set an example. But if he never took our punishment, but only set an example, that's not going to do anything, okay? So false claim to say the only effect, or even the primary effect of the death of Jesus is an example. That did happen, but that's not the main thing. Even in that passage I read in 1 Peter 2:21, he goes on then to quote from Isaiah 53, which is very much about penal substitution. So here's another false claim made by moral influence theory, is that Jesus was not our substitute. Remember, we talked about vicarious and how it's used in different ways. Well, no, Jesus wasn't our substitute. Well, he was. When we get into this here in the next, maybe the next video or the one after that, we're actually going to start looking more at penal substitution itself. And we're going to see how he was our substitute, okay? And so we can't say that he wasn't. So one more time, let me show you this. All these theories that we've talked about, the ransom theory, Christus Victor, satisfaction, moral influence, any others you can come up with, there are often some good things about them, but they are results of the atonement. They're not the primary central part of the atonement. You can see at the center is penal substitution. Penal substitution is the idea that I had a penalty and Jesus paid that penalty as my substitute. And because of that, I can look at him as a great example. He did bring back God's honor. He did pay a ransom. He did show in his resurrection that he was a victory. But at the heart of it all is that Jesus took the punishment that you should have paid, that I should have paid. He took that at the cross. That's what it is. We're going to continue on. Hopefully soon I'll be able to make another video, about to go on vacation and things like that. This summer is so busy, but keep looking for them. And then eventually I'm hoping to return back to my Why I Am Not a Calvinist series. I posted some videos on that and just haven't been able to do even more on that. So be looking for those. And let me know in the comments what you think, if there's anything specific you'd like for us to talk about, or if these videos are helpful to you at all in any way. All right, God bless, and I'll see you next time.